Hey everyone, and welcome to the next video in our Endgame series. Now, those of you who've been following this series know that we are currently investigating knight versus pawn endgames, in which one side has a knight and optionally pawns, and the other side has only pawns. Thus far, I've put out two videos on this type of endgame. First, I came out with the conceptual introduction, in which I outlined most of the important themes, ideas, concepts, definitions, and theoretical positions that undergird knight versus pawn endgames. And then I put out part one of the practicum, in which I give you a challenging set of exercises drawn from over-the-board play that are aimed at increasing and furthering your understanding and helping you synthesize all of the concepts presented in the introductory video and to improve your understanding of knight versus pawn endgames in general. So I'm preparing part two of the practicum right now, and I hope to record that in the coming few days. But in this video, we're going to do something a little bit different. In this video, we are going to examine two absolutely extraordinary knight versus pawn endgames that I came across in the course of preparing material for the practicum. And originally, I spent a couple of minutes on each of these positions, and I thought that they were pretty cool. And I was going to feature them in the practicum. But then I decided to look at them a little bit more carefully. There was just something about both of these positions. And as you'll see, they look nothing alike. They have absolutely nothing in common other than the fact that both of them are knight versus pawn endgames. And as I started analyzing them more carefully, I started discovering just unseemly amounts of crazy ideas, both positional and tactical, insane lines, and in general, I was just enthralled with both of these endgames. And I would go so far as to say that they're probably in the top 10 most interesting endgames that I have ever come across. And that's a bold statement because I've probably come across tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of endgames in my career as a chess player and coach, and I guess now content creator. So I thought that it behooved me to dedicate an entire video to talking you through my experience analyzing these endgames. And of course, I believe that they're deeply instructive, but most importantly, I think that they're just really beautiful and really, really cool. And I think that a lot of people, when they think about chess improvement, they want to know exactly what aspect of their understanding they're improving when they're working on something. But in my opinion, the process of analyzing a complicated position and really delving as deeply as possible into a position that at first you might find very confusing and might throw you in for a loop, that process of analysis and really getting to the truth of a position, that itself causes improvement. That itself benefits your understanding and your visualization, and it brings you to a higher level. So my hope with this video is, first of all, for us to have a blast. And I will do my best to be as clear and methodical as possible so that newer players can also understand the lines. So I'm going to try to strike a balance. I'm not going to go through every single line that I analyze, but I will try to hit on all or almost all of the pretty lines and pretty ideas that I discovered in the course of my analysis. So without further ado, we have a lot to get to. Two positions doesn't sound like a lot, but trust me, there is just so much to analyze, so much to look at. And again, I haven't really done a video like this before. I'm also just really, really exhausted. I'm recording this 2 days after I played a very, very tough match against Hikaru Nakamura and Levy, together with Robert Hess. A lot of you watching probably saw that match. So I do ask that you cut me a little bit of slack. I might be slightly lower energy, slightly less lucid than usual, but I will still do my absolute best to kind of hold your hand and walk you through these incredible positions to help you relive my experience. Okay, off we go. We're going to start with the position that is in front of you. As you can see, it's a traditional knight versus pawn endgame. White has a knight and a pawn, and black has two pawns. What I like about both of these positions is that they're not famous. And I like games that are not famous because it means nobody has seen them before. And I can bet a silver dollar that nobody even knows who these players are. Sander Kuhn, 2205, and Gabor Mirani, 2075. I think this game was played many years ago. I want to say early 2000s. Let me check. 1997, actually. So long time ago, two Hungarian players reach this position, and it is black to move in this position. Now, one glance should give you a very good sense of what the evaluation should be. If white loses his last pawn, well, the game should end in an immediate draw. If anything, you might be thinking, well, maybe black can try to play for a win somehow if he can get these pawns to squeeze through. But the reality is that black can draw the game several different ways, and the simplest is just to go king g2. Black goes king g2, takes the pawn on h2, and the game fizzles out into a draw. And most importantly, if white tries to use his king to box in black's king, that's not going to work, because after king h2, king f2, black can escape king h3, threatening to escape via g4. So white has to go king f3. And now the king threatens to escape via g1. So the king has to go back to f2 in order to keep the black king boxed in. There's simply nothing that white can do. So this is the cleanest draw, but it's not the only draw. The move g5 draws the game as well, and even king to g4 draws because there's nothing that white can do to stop the threat of king h3. But presumably, black was under the impression that literally any move under the sun should lead to a draw. And Gabor Moreni plays a move that doesn't really look bad. He plays the move h3. He pushes the pawn first, and his logic is that king g2 and king takes h2 is still unstoppable, and it is. But at this point, if you watched the introductory video and you listened to it carefully, you might kind of remember something. Remember a position that we discussed in that introductory video, and I'm going to put this position on the board right now. It's this one. This is a position that we examined in the conceptual introduction. And in this position, it is white to play. So black is going toward us. And amazingly, the lone knight, without even the assistance of a single pawn, is able to checkmate the enemy king in the corner. And obviously, this is an exception to the rule, which states that a knight and a king cannot checkmate the lone king. And this is possible, of course, because the king is blocked in by his own pawn on a3. So in very special circumstances, when the king is caught in the corner like this, the knight is able to maneuver through a series of very intricate and very precise moves in such a way as to force black to entomb his own king. So in this position, with white to play, white wins the game by force. It is checkmate in 5 moves. And I would encourage you to pause the video, and perhaps you remember the solution, but most likely you will need to kind of reconstruct it in your mind. See if you can find the forced mating sequence. And the real reason I'm making you find this is because I want to drink some tea. Okay, so this is nothing really to write home about. I mean, it's kind of nice if you've never seen this before. Essentially, the goal is this. You start with knight c5, so you need to prevent the black king from escaping. Black plays king to a1. Okay. And of course, the goal is to force black into playing a2. But to force black into playing pawn a2, you have to prevent black from being able to play king a2, which means controlling the a2 square with the knight, but doing it in such a way that the knight is also able to deliver checkmate if black plays a2. And if black plays a2, there's actually only 2 checkmating squares available, which are b3 and c2. And the way that white does this most clinically is first by playing king to c2. Now a2 runs into knight b3 checkmate, so black has to go king a2. And now the critical maneuver, knight d3, king a1, and knight c1. The knight has reached the target square, and it does exactly what it's supposed to. Covers a2, black has to push the pawn to a2, and now the knight delivers checkmate on b3. So this position has been known, I want to say, for hundreds and hundreds of years. I don't know who created it originally, but it's a very important concept in knight versus pawn endgames that yes, checkmate is possible. And you might think that this is extremely uncommon, but you might stand corrected after you look at the game that I'm about to show you. So back to Kuhn versus Moreni we go. So in this position, black decides to get a little bit fancy and plays the move h3. And amazingly, h3 loses the game. h3 is a losing move, but white has only one way to win the game, and this way is incredibly intricate. It's essentially all forced, yes, but nevertheless, finding the right knight maneuvers and finding the right time to do them is an incredibly difficult task. So in this position, first thing I want you to do is, again, pause the video, try to get your bearings, and try to understand what white is even aiming for, right? So I just showed you kind of the stem position. You can understand the similarities here, even though black does have that additional pawn on g6, which makes white's task quite a bit more complicated. But white made a very serious error in this position. I think that white made the most natural move, but as often happens in the endgame, the most natural move is incorrect. What should white do in this position? Okay, so first, let's examine the game continuation. In the game, Sanrakun was definitely aware, I think, that the king can be trapped and mated in the corner. And so his logic was like, okay, let's force this king to get to h2 so that we could trap it. And he plays the move knight g5 check. And this is also a mistake, which gives away the win. But now crazy stuff starts happening. I don't know if the players were in time pressure. Maybe they were, maybe not. Does it really matter? Black plays king to g2. White plays king to e2. Black takes the pawn. And white has achieved seemingly kind of the first checkpoint position. The king on h2 is now entombed. But one of the most important patterns and themes that really undergird knight endgames in general is that the knight is unable to lose a tempo. Right? Mathematically, the knight is kind of unable to triangulate on its own. So in knight versus pawn endgames particularly, one of the most important factors is whose move it is, which is often like a coincidental thing that completely dictates the evaluation, and as a standalone feature can completely change a position from winning to drawn. So to that end, if we were to return to the stem position that we just looked at, right? So we just looked at this position, white checkmates in 5 moves. But let's say that after knight c5, it were white to move again. Okay, let's say that white had 2 moves in a row. If white had 2 moves in a row, the position goes from winning to drawn, because after king to c2, king to a1, if you try to do the same thing, you're not going to get the tempi right. In this position with black to move, black has to go king a1, we go knight c1 and we checkmate. With white to move, knight c1 check king a1 is a dead end because white cannot pass the move, A, and B, the knight just mathematically is not able to lose a tempo. So in other words, using the knight alone, you're not able to reach the same position with the other side to move. And so it is super, super important to understand what you actually want. Whose move do you want it to be? And determining that can require some incredibly deep calculation. And that is the kind of core of the mistake that white made in the game. White failed to appreciate that by playing knight g5 check, you do get the position that you want, but you get it with the wrong side to move. So here's what happens. Black plays king to g2, king e2, king h2, king f2, king to h1. White plays knight e4. And now we need to pause for a second and kind of reconceptualize what's going on here, because it's obviously not the same position as the one that we just looked at. And I've already introduced to you the concept of a target position, a position that you're aiming for. I would compare it to a checkpoint in a video game, kind of a safe house. And target positions help you calculate because you don't always have to calculate all the way to checkmate. If you calculate up until a target position and you're pretty sure that from that target position you already know how to win, that can save you a lot of mental energy and that can make it more feasible to calculate. So we need to figure out as white what we actually want. Where do we want the knight? What do we want black to do? What's going on here in general? Well, just like in the stem position, the only way to win this game is to ultimately force black to push a pawn to h2. And to force black to push a pawn on h2, once again, you have to control the h2 square with the knight and do it in such a way that you're also contending for the g3 or f2 squares, because those are the mating squares should black play h2. So from what square is white able to do all of this? Well, what do we want to do? We want to control the h2 square, and we want to be able to access g3 and f2. And I was not a math major, so this we're straying into the realm of math puzzles, but the best square, the prime real estate, penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, there's a square like that. And that square is g4. The knight on g4 is perfectly positioned because A, it potentially blockades the g-pawn, which limits black's moves even further. B, it controls the h2 square, potentially forcing black to play h2. And C, it is ready to jump into, it's ready to jump into f2 with checkmate. So the target square is g4. And that is what white is trying to do by playing knight to e4. But here is the problem. Black pushes the g-pawn. Black's goal is to give this pawn away. in order to make stalemate more likely. Now, white plays knight g3 check, king h2. White tries to get his knight to g4. He gives a check. He gets the knight around, and you're almost there. And here's the thing. If it's white to move again in this position, white wins. White puts the knight on g4. Black is forced to play h2, and then we need one more maneuver. Then we need one more maneuver to win the game. So I'm going to do this in your head. After knight g4, h2, how does white checkmate the black king? Again, I would pause the video because we're going to come across this idea many, many times. Knight g4, h2, what's the mate there? So in this case, the presence of the g-pawn actually helps us, right? And this is very often the case when we're dealing with tactical endgames in which we're trying to avoid stalemate. Oftentimes, an enemy pawn is our greatest asset. So after knight g4, h2, the mate can be achieved many different ways. One of them is to play knight f6, clearing the way for the black pawn. Black has to play g4. And then we, for example, drop the knight back to h5. Black has to immolate himself, self-immolate with g3 check. And the knight takes g3 is checkmate. And I'll have an opportunity to play these moves on the board, so don't worry too much if you didn't fully visualize that. But the takeaway here is that g4 is the square that everyone wants. That is the place to be. But the problem is that black is first to the punch. Black is able to push the pawn at g4 preemptively. And you're like, but isn't this where white wants to go? Well, yes, but after knight takes g4, h2, unfortunately, white has no moves. And it's because this darn king is occupying the mating square of the knight. If the king was on f1 in this position, knight f2 would be mate. Unfortunately, it's not. There's nothing that white can do. Either you stalemate the black king or you let the black king out of the cage. Because knights are unable to lose a tempo, there is nothing that white can do to avert this line, right? If we go back, it's not like white can do some other knight maneuver, and this is going to prevent black from being able to push the pawn to g4 in time. This is the only thing that white can try. Alternatively, knight f6 leads to the same thing. Black plays g4, and it's a draw. You have to play knight takes g4, and then black plays h2. If you try to ignore the g-pawn, if you try to play knight h5, well, this move is futile because, for one thing, I think g3 check actually draws. Knight g3, king h2, and again, it's the same situation over and over again. We get the right position, but we get it with the wrong side to move. If it's black to move here, black just goes h2, and then we checkmate with knight g3, much like in the stem position. So what is the underlying problem here? Why do all of these lines not work? And before I answer that question, I forgot to actually show you how the game ends. The game ends with a victory for white. And I find this very hard to fathom, but after knight e4 g5, black does everything right in the game. King h1, knight e3, and in this position, rather than pushing g4 and drawing, black plays king h2, which is a horrendous move, and it just blunders mate in 3. It literally helps the knight along to g4. Black plays king h1, and clearly this was some sort of a hallucination, or it was time pressure. But hey, these endgames are hard, right? When you're looking at it and you're kind of sipping your coffee and I'm talking you through it, yeah, everything is super obvious, right? But when you're sitting there and you're freaking out and you've got 10 seconds, try choosing between, king h2 and g4. So that's the thing with endgames, is like when you're playing them, it's so much harder to figure everything out, which is why it's so important to have a very crisp and very clear command of the concepts that will really, really help you find the right move quickly. The game ended with checkmate on the 56th move, knight f2. But we rewind all the way back to the start. The root of white's problem was that he got the right position, but he got it with the wrong side to move. And we need to think about how that could possibly be averted, because I did say that knights are unable to lose a tempo. But does white have another piece on the board? Maybe a piece that is capable of losing a tempo? Well, I'm giving you a bit of a hint here. See if you can pause the video and find the extraordinary winning move. And I say extraordinary because there truly is only one winning move. Well, technically there are two, but there's only one move that wins the game smoothly. Okay, so the key insight here is that you need to waste a move. And to waste a move, you need to make an empty move with your king. You basically need to pass the turn to black. And you can do that by playing the move king to d4. king to d4 is just a move you cannot possibly stumble on unless you have reverse engineered this entire operation and then understood that you want the same thing with the other side to move. So you might ask, well, what about why not king to d2? The reason king to d2, and technically this move is winning just because you can get back to the initial position and then play king d4, is because black is not obliged to play king to g2. Black can play king f2. Remember from the introductory video, the opposition draw, right? Sometimes you have an extra knight, but because the enemy king is able to keep opposition, you're unable to make any progress. And this is a great example of that. If you move your knight to g5, then you're back to the wrong position, the position of the wrong side to move. So you have to do this entirely with your king. And that is why here you would have to go king to d3. But if you start with king to d4, you're able to include shouldering, which I think is really, really cool. There's this kind of small battle going on between the kings that's kind of on the side. If black plays king f2 and tries to stall, then, well, you're simply able to go king e4. This is shouldering. If king g2, then king e3, and we transpose. If black kind of stays in the center, then the win is pretty mundane. You can actually just drag the knight back, knight g5, king f4, and knight f3, protecting the h2 pawn. And here we just have one last little maneuver. Again, that g4 square is so nice. Knight e5, king g2, knight g4. And to look at that knight on g4, it's defending the pawn, and it's also controlling the f2 square. Finally, black's king is pushed away from the ledge, and then we can just like easily collect all of black's pawns. So this win is pretty easy. Now let's get to the fun part. Black goes king to g2. And we also, and we also need to investigate, by the way, the move g5. Because remember, the g pawn in most cases helps white because it averts stalemate. So it's a very smart idea for black to try to give this pawn up first and then play king g2. But first, let's consider the main line with king to g2. Now, white follows the king into the corner, king e3, king takes h2, king f2, king to h1. If black plays g5 in this position, then we directly transpose, of course, on the other side of the board to the stem position that we just examined. So here, the winning process should basically be automatic to you if you've been paying attention. You just have to get the knight around to f1. Knight e4, king h2, just avoid knight g3 because that's stalemate. So you have to go through d2. Knight f1, h2, and knight g3 is checkmate. So this is fairly straightforward. Black can't give the pawn up. Black has to go king h1. And now, once again, we need the target square for the knight, and the target square for the knight remains the same. It is g4. So we need to think about how we get the knight there most efficiently without allowing black to just like randomly push the g pawn. And the answer to that question, of course, is knight to g5. So you temporarily blockade this pawn. If black plays h2, look at how helpful this pawn is. You go knight e4. Again, g5, knight g3 is made. So black has to go king h2. We give the check. We jump the knight up to e5. And that's it. Black is busted. Now remember, in this position, black's pawn was already on g5. And black was able to sack the pawn with g4 and make the draw. Here, black is one tempo behind. And this is the crazy paradox. White was we were the one who lost a tempo in the beginning by making that empty king move. And yet now it's suddenly black who is one tempo short with the g pawn. And why is that? Why does that happen? Well, it's not as paradoxical as it sounds. The reason that happens is because black's king is just on a different spot. And we were able to gain a tempo by delivering this check on f3. And this is what allows us ultimately to blockade the pawn on g4. So black has to go either king h2 or g5. For example, let's say black goes king h2. It's much the same thing. We go knight g4 check, king h1, king f1. And we're almost there. We're forcing black to play g5. And now we just need one last push. Pause the video. See if you can figure out the final mating sequence here. You've basically already seen it. Just the next move can be a little bit tricky to some people. Okay, so here you just have to make one more waiting move. And in general, in my experience working with particularly young students, I think that people just inherently have a hard time making these waiting moves. They want to do something. You want to give a check. You want to move the knight somewhere. But remember, in the endgame, a waiting move can be an incredibly powerful weapon because in many cases, your opponent has to dig their own grave, such as in this case, literally after king f2, h2. It's like the cask of Amontillado. Edgar Allan Poe would be very happy with this position. But the reason I thought of that is because I just watched Fall of the House of Usher on Netflix. Highly recommended, fantastic show. Not that anybody cares. This is an endgame video. Let's get back to the game. And here, of course, the mate is straightforward. Knight f6, g4, and then we just need to catch the pawn. Knight h5, check. Knight takes g3 is a beautiful and lovely checkmate. Okay, but we're not done yet because black has a couple more resilient attempts. Let's go through that line one more time. So remember that black started with h3. This is what led to all of black's problems because the h3 pawn takes away the h3 square from black's king. Now we figured out that we need to basically waste a move, and we can do that only with king to d4. That's the only way to make progress. After black plays king to g2, otherwise black gets shouldered, we tail the king into the corner, and now we need to get this knight onto the target square g4 without allowing the g-pawn to advance too far. And that is why we go through the g5 square. Black basically has to toggle back and forth. We get the knight to the target square with check. We wait for black to bury himself with h2, and then we have this final beautiful knight maneuver to deliver the checkmate. But now we need to go back and consider the more resilient options. So first of all, in this position, black can say, well, wait a second. If the g-pawn is always such a problem for us, why don't we give it away first with g5? And white has to take that pawn, because otherwise black's just going to go g4 and g3, and then white risks losing. If you're knight g5, king g2, how are you going to win without that g-pawn? Isn't it just going to be stalemate? And again, here it's very important to be concrete. It's easy to make these broad generalizations, but remember that you don't always need that g-pawn in order to set up the mate. You didn't need it in the stem position that we examined, and the knight turns out to be in the perfect spot to set up that mate. Here, once again, we go king e3. Now, there's a really lovely detail if black goes king g1, which is the smartest defensive move. But first, if black plays king to h2, we transpose back into our familiar stem mating pattern, knight e4, king h2, knight d2, king h1, knight f1, h2, and knight g3. And I still find this, even the most rudimentary mating concept with a lone knight, to be really mind-blowing, honestly, how this can be a thing in chess. Okay, so instead of king takes h2, a smarter idea is to stall with the king on g1 and basically say, I'm not going to h2. You're going to have to make me do that. Right? You're going to have to make me. And in this position, okay, king f3 is the easiest way to win because we're simply threatening to go king g3. Remember that you don't have to win the game by checkmate. Right? You can also win the game by just taking the pawn and promoting the h-pawn. So king f3 now forces black to take on h2. And now king f2, king h1, knight e4, you know the drill, we have transposed. So pretty cool stuff. And that it. There's one other line I wanted to look at really quickly, but it all transposes into the same thing. All roads lead to Rome. I was just going to mention that if black plays g5 here, I think I already mentioned it, knight takes g5, and we get the exact stem position. So the hardest thing about figuring out the mate in this position, I think, is understanding that g4 is the target square. Because you might say, well, okay, but there's other squares where the knight controls h2 and can deliver checkmate on f2 or g3. And actually, now that I think about it, I think the only other square is f1. But what happens if we try to get the knight to f1? Why is that not a viable winning option? So let's say we go check, and instead of knight e5, knight g4, we go knight d2, g5, and knight f1. Well, the reason this is drawn is because black has a g-pawn. So the g-pawn alternates as black's best friend and black's worst enemy. Here it's black's best friend because black has a move that's not h2, and white is in Zugzwang. Now, if it was black to move again, it would still be a draw because black would just go g3 check, knight takes g3, king h2, and again, white would have the wrong tempo. But with white to move, it's not even close. You can't even make black give up the g-pawn. So white simply has no way to make progress. So you actually need to blockade that pawn every step that you have, every chance that you get. And that is why you need to get the knight around to g4 before black is able to get that pawn to g4. that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you win this incredible endgame. I think that concludes part 1 of the video. I hope that wasn't too, frantic, frenetic, you name it. There was one other position that I didn't put on the board. Yeah, I was just going to illustrate when we considered the game continuation that this position occurred with white to move. Okay, this position occurred in the game with white to move. And what happened is that white played knight e4, black played g5, white played knight f6, and black could have played g4 and made the draw. If it's black to move here, black is forced to play king h2. And in the same exact variation, why can't black do the same thing? Because knight takes g4 is a check. This is the crux of the matter. If the black king was on h1 right now, black would play h2 and make the draw. With the king on h2, white is able to checkmate on f2. So I really, really think that this game is not only a great illustration of the potential for checkmate in knight versus pawn endgames, and I've experienced this in my own games, but also it really shows us how the side that is to move, that in itself is a crucial concept to really wrap your head around. If you sense that an endgame is really coming down to just raw calculation or raw tactics, you always have to be aware of whose move it is in certain critical positions. And it's really worthwhile in many cases to ask yourself, okay, what would be the evaluation of this position if it were my opponent's move? Okay, what would be the evaluation? Because sometimes you're like, wait a second. If it was my opponent's move, I would actually be winning for XYZ reason because black would be in Zugzwang. And that could then dictate your course of action. If white had understood this here, I think he would have had a serious chance of finding king to d4. Otherwise, you're not just going to stumble on this move. This is a completely nonsensical move. Otherwise, you have to do it through that process of logical reasoning. Okay, guys, so we're 30 minutes in. I think we're going to spend about the same amount of time on the second game. And this second game comes from a correspondence affair that was played in 2020 pretty recently between two fairly decent correspondence players. And some of you watching will know exactly what correspondence chess is. It's essentially chess that is played over the course of many, many days through different types of mediums, sometimes email, sometimes a dedicated website. But the bottom line is that in modern correspondence chess, computer use is allowed, and you have, something like 5 or 6 days to make a single move, which is why a lot of top grandmasters actually use the correspondence database, which is published every year. It is the collection of top correspondence games. They use that over, Levon Aronian's games or Magnus's games, because these guys sit in front of their computer for days. And the top correspondence players are not themselves like GMs or IMs. They could be 2000 or 2100, but they're generally extremely good at working with the computer. Like they might actually be software engineers. So they have a very keen understanding of what the strengths and weaknesses are of the computer. And obviously something like Stockfish doesn't have a lot of weaknesses, but if you're analyzing a position for several days, you can't just go with Stockfish's top recommendation. You have to provide human input and guide the computer in the right direction. So correspondence I'm personally not attracted to it, but I think it's kind of interesting, and it produces some of the most high quality chess that you see. Lucky us, we get this endgame thanks to correspondence chess. So sorry for the digression. Let's jump into the position that is in front of you. I tried to find one position where we had the knight. In this position, we are handling the pawns. So black is up a knight, but white has 5 pawns against 2. So white has 3 pawns for the piece. But just a quick look at this position reveals that every single pawn is in some way blockaded. The knight is blockading these connected passers, and the king is blockading these other connected passers. So I think the snap judgment that I would make personally if I looked at this position is, well, this is a draw, because neither side can really make any progress. Because if you look carefully, black is not threatening to take on b4, which is pretty clear. Let's make a random move for white. That's actually what happened in the game, but we'll get to that shortly. If black plays king takes b4, white wins via the trousers method, right? Passers on opposite side of the board is a knight's worst enemy. The knight is unable to handle these two tasks, king c5, c7, knight d6, h6. This is very obvious, but white actually wins only by 1 tempo. h7. And if the knight were already on f7, then black would be able to take the pawn on c7. But obviously here, the knight has to move and white promotes to a queen. So black doesn't have a threat, but really neither does white. Trying to sacrifice one of the pawns is futile because the knight's just going to cover the h7 square from g5. So at first glance, it looks like a draw. And if you run Stockfish at a relatively lower depth, so like even depth 25, I'm obviously doing this on chess.com. I have the engine open. It's giving basically equality. It's not seeing the win. And this myopia, right, this nearsightedness is a product of complexity of the endgame. The endgame is so complicated that in order to see the win, you have to see like over 20 plus moves ahead. And that's actually what makes this endgame really, really magical. So in reality, I will spoil it a bit by saying that white is actually winning in this position. White is winning. And the winning idea, there is no winning idea. To categorize it as an idea would be a great insult to what it is. It is a genius Nobel Prize winning plan. In order to win this game, you really don't have to calculate any variations or very, very minimal variations. What you need to do is come up with a grand plan. This plan involves, let's see how many stages. 1, 2, 3. This plan involves 3 stages. Each stage is aimed at inducing a concession. And by waging this war of attrition, slowly but surely using the only mobile piece at your disposal, which is the king, you are able, as the white pieces, to break down black's fortress. And the way in which this fortress is broken down, in my opinion, it's stunning. And it's a different kind of stunning than we saw in the previous game. It's a little bit less flashy, but in my opinion, it's no less beautiful. So my request is that you pause the video. If you really want to go the extra mile, you should set this position up. If you have some time, you should give yourself 10, 15 minutes and go to town. You can move the pieces around, but your goal is essentially to come up with a plan that you can, sort of roughly describe in terms of moves. Like, I want to be here when my opponent is there, and eventually I want to do X, Y, and Z. This is difficult, but I think this will really, really help further your understanding. It's white to play. I'll give you 10 seconds. I'll step aside for just a moment. I'll be right back. And then I will reveal this incredible, incredible idea. Okay. So the inspiration for the way in which I'm presenting this position comes from another position. And of course, I forgot to set it up, so I'm going to have to find it on the fly. It comes from another position that was shown to me by my good friend Alexander Bortnik. And there's a certain category of positions in which the opposing side is essentially devoid of counterplay. Like, their moves are completely deterministic and totally predictable. And in this case, black's moves are restricted to king c6 and king b5, because moving the knight would involve conceding a forward movement of the pawn, which is a big concession. And in most cases, d4 is not a dangerous breakthrough, as we're going to see, except in one circumstance in which it is actually decisive. So in situations where your opponent has like a deterministic set of moves, you can perform what I call a long-term calculation, where instead of calculating move by move, you can almost calculate in large chunks. You're like, okay, I can go from f1 to like a4, and then I can induce this move. And then I can go from a4 to like square x, and I can induce that move. So you're not calculating move by move. You're sort of calculating more generally. And of course, that contains its own risk, and you might miss a detail along the way. But this is often the way in which you need to crack the secret of these types of positions. And I think all of this is going to make a lot more sense once we actually start analyzing. So let's outline the plan, and then I might try to find the position that inspired me to show this game. So in order to crack black's defenses, we need to do one of two things. One pair of our pass pawns has got to be promoted, right? That is the only way that we're going to win. Either this queenside pair or this kingside pair. So we need to choose our enemy. Either we fight against the knight or we fight against the black king. And if you look at this for a couple of moments, there's a pretty straightforward idea that comes to mind. And that idea is just to walk the king over to h4 and just support the pawns and move them forward. And generally, connected passers are going to overwhelm the knight. So let's investigate that line. King f2, black is confined to c6 and b5. But the problem is that after king g3, king b5, king h4, you can see the double question mark. Why is it there? Well, why do you think it's there? The king is at the farthest point away from the center. And precisely at this moment, black is able to strike with d4. Now, the problem isn't that the pawn is unstoppable. It's not unstoppable. White obviously has to return to g3. White doesn't have time to play g5. Black promotes way before white is able to do anything. So white has to go back to g3. Now black plays d3. White goes back to f2. Still looks like everything's under control, but watch this. King takes b4. Okay, now king e3 loses. The lines transposing to each other. You play c6. Still not obvious that black is winning, but he is. d2. d2. Black threatens to promote. If you play c7, I can stop that pawn with my knight. And this is actually crazy that the knight ends up stopping the queenside pawns. And this comes back to something that I was talking about in the previous videos, where the knight has this terrible reputation of being very bad with passed pawns, but sometimes the knight can really redeem itself and prove its worth. So the Shawshank Redemption here happens with the knight on d6. If you play king to e2, the line that I have is king e2, king c3. You throw in c7 for a good measure, knight to d6. Now black is threatening king c2. So unfortunately, again, you have to dig your own grave with king to d1, king d3. You can try to deflect the knight with c8 equals queen, but that only staves off disaster because that knight is just going to return right back to home base. Knight d6, h7, and really stunning. Knight c4, knight e4 doesn't matter. White makes a queen. It doesn't matter because black mates on f2. So this is like the one line that you have to calculate in its entirety, and that's really difficult to do. Right? So amazingly, the move king h4 actually loses the game. So that's a very important, what's the word? Conclusion. That's a very important data point. That was the term I'm looking for. That's a very important data point. So we know that the king, at least in the current arrangement, cannot reach h4. Now, maybe if you can induce some sort of a concession, that is going to change. So Chiba understands that the only way he's going to make progress is by seeking it on the queen side, by trying to defeat the black king. And the way you do that is by trying to access the a4 square with white's king and trying to push black's king away so that white is able to push the queenside pawn. And that is exactly what white does. That is step one of the three-step winning plan. You need to get the king to the queen side. So king e2, king c6. Now, I should mention that in a position like this, d4 is futile. And this can be a little bit hard to understand, but what tends to happen in almost all of these lines is that, for instance, after king d3, knight e5 check, king takes d4, knight takes g4, you get a situation in which black's king is still tied down and white has one pawn remaining, which is going to be the game-winning pawn. So as long as you avoid a blunder with king e4, as long as you go around the force field, you win the game. Because king takes b4 is never going to work, ever, because white has the h-pawn, right? And this comes back to the concept that I really started with, which is that the most coveted passed pawn, the best passed pawn to have in most circumstances to fight against a knight is a corner pawn. Because in most cases, barring a situation where the king is close, you get a situation like this. h6, the knight can stop the pawn. That's not the issue. The issue is that white's king follows along, and black is unable by one tempo, to tail the king into the corner and make that classic imprisoned king draw. White wins the game and gets out of the hole. White promotes the pawn. So it's not like it's easy to win in this line, but it is winning. And this type of line is going to recur again and again and again in like several different iterations. But if we go all the way back, all of this was forced, by the way. Yeah, after king to d3, we've determined that king takes b4 loses the game. And if black does nothing, for example, like if black plays knight h6, then you're just going to start casually walking the king up. This is a much easier way to win. King c6, for example, king e5 or king f4, doesn't matter. King f6, and black is unable to sit on, as the Russian expression goes, to sit on multiple chairs, because the moment you go this way, I go that way. You know, the moment you go knight g4 check, I go king g7 and then h6. And for newer players, it's worth paying attention to the fact that these pawns are what I call self-sufficient. So what I mean by that is you don't really have to worry about their survival. You don't need the king to babysit them. Any situation like this is going to be winning because the b4 pawn is untouchable. Just like in the ideal arrangement where the knight sits behind the pawn, this is also an ideal arrangement because we're keeping the king completely at bay. So we've considered d4. Again, king takes b4, it loses to the obvious c6, c7, and h6. You can take a look at this on your own. I'm just checking what else I analyzed. King to c4, also c6. And so black is basically confined to passivity with king c6. White continues the journey, king d2, king b5. Now, again, I looked at d4 in this position, and here there's a slightly different iteration because after e to ed, king d3, black has king d5. And for a second, it looks like, wait a second, white is stuck. Like none of the pawns are going. Black is threatening this very nasty check on e5. Is white losing here? In fact, white is winning with a lovely deflection sacrifice. White wins with a deflection sacrifice c6. And if black takes on c6, it's pretty easy to understand that this is a winning position because, again, black is overextended. The king has to babysit the b pawn, and so white's just going to walk the king over to the king side. This is not worth analyzing. Black, of course, is going to try knight e5 check. We are going to get out of the way with king to e2. The c pawn has to be captured, otherwise it moves up to c7. D3 check here is, again, useless because the pawn is going to be blockaded. So let's say that black plays king takes c6. And now off goes the h pawn, h6 and h7. And amazingly, the presence of the d pawn actually doesn't change anything because we're going to use the b pawn to get rid of it. So after king d6, we're going to go b5. And then we're going to move the king up to d3. And again, black is overextended. This is like a constantly recurring theme. The knight can be a hero, but it can also be a dummy. And it can try to give a check and throw white off. Again, king d5, obviously there's b6 and white wins on the spot. It can try to throw white off, but white's just going to slide up to e4. Promotion is threatened, so the knight has to go back. Knight f7 is a very tricky move. It seems like you're threatening knight g5, but white doesn't care. You just go b6 because you're threatening b7. So black has to take. Or I consider d3, which is the same thing. Takes. And now g5. Lovely move. You're threatening g6, sort of. No, you're not really threatening g6 because there's a fork on e5. So black can afford to play the move king c5. And here there's actually an only move for white. And a lot of these lines, right, are impossible to calculate over the board, which is why this kind of thing could probably have only happened in a correspondence game. And I deliberately misled you by saying that you don't really have to do any calculation because the point of this position is not to calculate these lines. These lines I'm showing you because I want to give you context and I want to show you that the position is objectively winning, but it's not like they have particular instructive value, although they're kind of interesting. Here, the move g6 draws not because the fork is so strong. Now, often this is not a big deal because you can just inch the king up to f5. But here specifically, black is able to make the imprisoned king draw. Remember the imprisoned king draw where the enemy king basically tails you into the corner and forces stalemate. Here, black is finally in time to do that. So you have to be very, very careful. And so therefore, on move 60, after king to c5, again, you have to basically evade the force field. You have to step aside to e3 so that there are no forks. You're threatening g6 and g7, so black has to go back into the corner. Now it's time to step up to e4. Knight to g6. King d6, king f5 is essentially the same thing. Yeah, king d6, king f5, king e7. For a second, it looks like black is in time. You push g6, black goes king f8, black is chilling. It's a draw. Nope, king f6. This is a beautiful position. This is a lovely position. The knight is in the corner. The black king has made it all the way back, and it doesn't frickin' matter because black is busted. Knight g6, king g6, white promotes. Knight f7, one last try. If you don't care about that knight, you're not going to take it. That's stalemate. You push g7 and you make a queen. How fitting is that? You work that hard to win the knight, and then you actually don't take it. Okay, so what line were we just analyzing? We were analyzing, again, the move d4, which is black's only source of active counterplay. And over the board, this would probably have been a worthy try, although I don't think it's actually that hard to find any one particular move with white, just because there's not a lot of options. But in a correspondence game, black understands that white has ample time to work out all the details, and so he defends more objectively by staying in place with king b5. Okay, so king c3, king c6. Now white repeats the position once. Not sure why, because there's no time to get in correspondence. Doesn't matter. Then white continues along the same path. King to b2, king to b5, and king to a2. Also kind of like a waste of time. Now, what's important to realize here is that king to b3, which is the more natural way to do it, you're trying to get to a4, would be problematic after king to b5. Because if you go king to a3 here, actually, wait a second. No, this would also work. This would also work. I think this would actually be simpler. White had this very convoluted way of getting to a4. He went king d3 and then back to c3, now to b2. And again, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that d4 just never works. Because here it's a slightly different situation. After king c2, king d5, remember, we had this exact position with white's king already on d3. And there the move was c6. But here it doesn't make sense to play c6 because we're not going to win the d pawn. So we want to go king to d2. And black is in Zugzwang. This is actually a lovely situation. If the knight moves, white pushes one of the pawns. That's cut and dry. If the king moves, then we've transposed into a line that we've already looked at. We can go up to d3, and now we can push c6, and we looked at this exact line, knight e5, check king e2. Remember this? And the line ended tempo for tempo. I think we considered king takes c6, h6, h7, and then we gave the b pawn up for the d pawn, and then we won the game by a single tempo. So there's actually a lot of transpositions here. So after king b2, king b5, white plays king a2. Maybe this is to avoid king a3, king c4, because if black plays king c4 here, then white's again going to play c6. And okay, now this position is slightly less clear-cut because white's king is far away from black's pawn majority, and so black can actually try to make a queen as well. Black can go d4, e takes d4, and e4, trying to keep the pawn as far away from the king. Now, e takes d4 is just stupid because of c7 and then h6, and the king can actually just stop the d pawn with king b2. So e4 is black's best chance, but white is still winning. c7, knight d6, and h6 is really bad because both sides are going to promote at the same time, and white's going to have some extra pawns, but it's not a clear-cut win. And one of the most important skills particularly in tactical endgames, is to know when to play prophylactically. Okay, this is really, really hard because imagine you're sitting at the board, you've got this position, h6 is just screaming to be played. You're pushing the pawn, you can smell the promotion, but h6, black plays e3, and then e2, and then you both promote, and then you still have to win this queen endgame. But if you make one prophylactic move, which is a very scary move to make, king b2, then you win the game immediately. So here's what happens. If black tries to block the king's entrance with king to d3, because if black plays e3, then you just stop the pawn with king c2 and then play h6. That's it. e2, king d2, it's easy. So black has to try king to d3. Now, play king to c1. Look at this. Now, king e2 would block black's own pawn, so black has to push. Now we simply go king d1. Prophylactic play with the king. Terrifying. This has to be very accurately calculated, but it's terrible luck for black. It's just luck that black's knight is so poorly placed, be it on e6, be it on g6. This would be winning for black. And we saw a very similar scenario of this, right? Because it's on d6, it's unable to reach one of the four mating squares in time. The moment it moves away, white promotes c8 or white promotes the h pawn, and white wins the game. So what's interesting is that if white had played the immediate king a3, maybe what white was afraid of what white was afraid of is king c4, c6, d4, takes an e4. And in this position, actually, wait a second. You can still go king b2. What am I saying? No, this is the same thing. So yeah, so I think there's really no significance to the move king a2 over king a3. White is just like wasting time. So king c6, king b3, king b5. And finally, stage one has been achieved. Okay, stage one has been achieved. Why? Because now if the king moves back, we're able to step forward and black is officially in Zugzwang. Either you have to step back and allow b5. That's huge progress. Or you have to play d4, and we already know that this loses. We've seen a million of these types of moves before. King c2, king c6, king d3, and we again get the same position. Or black has to move the knight and allow the h-pawn or the g-pawn forward, and both of those signify tremendous progress. Black chose the lesser evil. In this position, rather than dropping the king back to c6, black moves the knight to g5. And stage one has officially been achieved. But just because we've played h6 does not mean that we're now going to promote our pawns. Black can continue waiting with knight h7, knight g5. So what's stage two? What's the second part of our plan? Well, we need to remember something about what I said initially, which is that when you look at the initial position, the most obvious plan, at least to me, involves getting the king to h4 and then pushing g5. And one thing that people often forget is that in chess, tiny details, tiny intricacies impact the evaluation. So an idea could fail concretely in one situation. You shift a pawn from h2 to h3 or h5 to h6, and suddenly the same idea works. You have to recalculate stuff based on changes that happen in the position. You have to update the data set, basically. I feel like the software engineers watching me are like, this guy is full of you know what? It's like he's a history major. He is. Okay, so back to the game position. Where are we on the video? Okay, we're almost an hour in, and we're pretty close to being done here. So knight g5, h6, and black starts toggling between h7 and g5. It's time for stage two. We go all the way back. Back. King c3, king d3, king e2, king f2. Painstakingly all the way back. Now, again, d4 is just never going to work. And now it's definitely not going to work with a pawn sitting on h6. The process here is much the same. You bring the king up to d3. Black has to continue toggling. And then you just use the c pawn to deflect the king. And then you use the b pawn again to deflect the king. And then you use the g and the h pawns to win. So like king d6, b5. Let's say black tries to win, knight g5. The simplest win is b6. And just don't go king e5 and blunder the fork. Again, you have to go around the force field with king e3 and king f4. This is very common, by the way, to have to do something like this. And this is winning by several tempi, just king f5 and king f6. So king f2, knight h7, king to g2. Again, white is wasting time. Maybe he had to go like on vacation or something, and he was just like mailing a couple moves in. And finally, he goes king g3. And black plays king to b5, which reaches the most important position in the entire game and the big reveal of this entire operation. If black had played knight g5 instead, and then knight e6, this was a pretty cool defensive idea. If I was playing black in an over-the-board game, I might try this because h7 looks like it promotes a pawn, but knight f8, using a technique that I covered in the introductory video, right? Using the fork to stop the pawn. You have to be very careful about that. Believe it or not, h8 equals knight. Also something that I mentioned, oftentimes this is the way to avert disaster, or at least you have something on the board. If you make a queen though, black forks you with knight g6 check, you lose all winning chances. But instead of the impatient h7, you can just play the very methodical g5. Again, black's only try is to bank that passer, but takes g6, d3. Actually, this is the one line where black is able to promote, but it's very small consolation because white actually makes h8 queen and delivers the check on e8. This is a fork. King d5, queen d7 loses the queen. So black has to block. And now we throw in an intermezzo with b5, just the power of pawns. King c7, another intermezzo. Now b7 and c6. Look at just how the pawns metastasize beautifully all the way up to b7 and c6. They're like a tumor, and black is busted because the g-pawn, together with the king, you're going to surmount the knight's resistance. Knight d4, great attempt. Look at how the knight is able to just like try to do everything at the same time, but you just ignore king g5, knight c6, and king f6, another technique that we discussed, which is 2 squares between the king and the knight when you are standing laterally. Okay, and then 1 square between the king and the knight when you're standing diagonally. That is the way to dominate the knight because you're controlling the e7 and e5 squares. g7 is unstoppable. So all of these wins are like tempo for tempo. But after king to g3, having calculated that, black decides to continue staying put. And now we get to the big reveal. The correct move in this position is king to h4, preparing g5. Now wait a second, I hear you say. I remember something about king h4 being a losing move at the start of the game. Well, what's the difference? Well, here's the difference. I'm going to rewind all the way back. I have so much analysis here. I have to actually find it. Here we go. This was the position in which king h4 loses. The only difference is that the knight has shifted from h7 to, from f7 to h7, and the pawn is on h6 rather than h5. Here it loses, I remind you, because after d4, we have the trade. White has to stop the pawn. Black supports the pawn with his king. And at the end of the day, black is able to checkmate the king with the knight. That is the key insight. If we compare this to the position, with the knight on h7, we get the same line, takes, king g3, you try to stop the pawn. Black takes on b4. This is what black did to win the game. But the difference is that after c6, d3, wait a second, let me think for a second. Wait, let's go back to the initial. So here, d4 takes, king g3, d3, king f2, king takes b4, c6, d2. Yes, okay, so just making sure that we are essentially making the same moves. King f2, king takes b4, c6, d2, same thing, king e2, king c3. You can even play c7 here, actually, and win because the knight is unable to stop the pawn. Now it's on h7, right? The knight was on f7, and that caused black to actually win the game because black had knight d6. Here, the knight is excommunicated. White simply promotes the pawn with check. And so that is stage 2, which has been complete. And that is to get the king to the other side of the board, having realized that the same idea which wins the game at the start now loses the game because the knight is much more compromised and much more passive on h7. Pretty amazing stuff. And white does this, notice, using basically only the king, which I find to be really, really interesting. And of course, the implicit threat of moving the pawns. The pawns are offering their silent support. So black, again, has no choice but to wait. But now it's time for the final stage, the decisive stage. You're basically just pushing the pawns. And d4 is now going to be permanently futile. Black plays knight f8, white goes king g4, threatening king f5. Because this is such a big threat, black has to try d4. There's no other choice. Takes. And we already know the safer way to win this. King f3, king d5. Now, white kind of toys with black. King e2 is the easiest way to win. For some reason, white plays king f2 first. Okay. And now king e2, whatever. You do you. King d3, king d5, king d3. And that's it. The game is over because if black moves the knight, you go h7. And yeah, technically black can stop the pawn for a couple more moves, but look at what you do here. How does white win this game? How does white win this? Pause the video maybe one last time. See if you can figure out exactly how white wins this position. Because it's easy when I'm showing you, but then suddenly when you're staring at it, you're like, wait a second, what do I do? Okay, so actually, the key is that you need to triangulate. And what I love about endgames is that oftentimes you have to borrow concepts from other types of endgames, like from pawn endgames or rook endgames. And this is why studying endgames helps with other aspects of the game, because it develops this sort of logical thinking and creativity, and you basically just get the whole package. So the point is that king to d3 always runs into this check, and then the knight can go back. So you need to wait for black to make a concession. And the way to do that is king to d2. So either black has to move the king back, and now we can move the king forward, and we're able to squeeze in c6. Or black has to move the knight back, and then the same thing. We can move the king up to d3, and then we can push c6. Now remember, if the knight gives a check, then h8 queen is going to be threatened, so white's going to promote. Black has to take the pawn. We take on d4, and this is a very elementary version of a position that we've been coming across a million times. One more reminder, king d5 is still winning. Even king e6 is still winning, but be very, very careful in these situations to spot all of these knight forks. Amazingly, even this position is winning because, again, king is one square away from the knight diagonally. You push g6, g7, and g8, but this is a pretty rare situation, so I wouldn't play with fire like that. I would just go king e4 and king f5 and win the game that way. So knight e6 doesn't work. Black played king e5 in the game. Now, finally, it's time to push the queenside pawns b5, b6. King takes d4, and black resigned in this position because although black can win one of white's pawns, this has been the story of the game. The other pawn, together with the king, is going to decide, and the pawns on the opposite side of the board are totally self-sufficient. So simply king f6, king g7, and you can just go h7. Black has to give the knight up for the king, and this is a winning position. I will let you figure out the rest. Of course, we will have at some point a video on like theoretical endgames, theoretical pawn endgames. That's still planned for the future, but this is a winning position, and so black resigned the game after white took on d4. This is the final position, just for visual effect. And this is the initial position. That's how much it changed. And so just to summarize, the plan of action here for white, the winning plan, is to first realize that getting the king to h4 immediately loses to d4. So first step is you need to get the king to a4. By doing that, you're forcing black to either play d4, which loses, or move the knight. By moving the knight, black is allowing white to push the pawn. Stage 2 involves walking the king all the way back to h4, having realized that the knight is now more passive, which means d4 no longer works with the king on h4. And stage 3 involves pushing g5 and basically pushing pawns on both sides of the board and forcing black to play d4, and then sacking one of your kingside or queenside pawns for the d pawn and winning the rest of the game. So maybe I overhyped it by saying that this is, one of the most extraordinary positions I've seen. I think maybe not in the tactical sense it isn't. The previous position takes care of that. But if you just think like conceptually, how smooth, how clean the winning procedure is here, you really only find this shit in the end game. Pardon my French. But this stuff where like you have a 3-stage plan and everything works to perfection, that's one of the things that I love about endgames. And because we're over an hour into the video, I won't have time to show the sort of original inspiration. I will save that for a different video. I promise that I will show that other position that Bortnik showed me. But for now, I think I will leave you to ponder and reflect on the two endgames that we analyzed. The first one, of course, involved checkmating the black king using your bare knight and your king and forcing the enemy pawns to entomb the king. So this was conceptually a lot easier, but tactically, calculationally, this was more involved. This other game was very conceptual, and there was a lot of calculation to do at the end of the day, but this just shows you how incredibly powerful pawns can be. And I really think that these two games symbolize, to me, the redeeming factor about studying endgames, which is that you feel satisfied and you feel like you've improved as a player after you finish a deep analysis session. So hopefully I've done a halfway decent job of representing some of the beauty of these endgames to you. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you didn't find my presentation obnoxious or overwhelming or too fast. If you did, please always let me know in the comments. I mean, this endgame series, it's a labor of love. Honestly, it is really the hardest type of video that I make. I often have to reshoot the take like 40 or 50 times. I'm serious. Like the first 5-10 minutes, because I'm just not satisfied with the way that I'm introducing the video. So I'm really trying to get this right. And your honest feedback, whether it's positive or constructively critical, is indispensable. So just a huge shout out to the community at large for being so supportive and so sweet. It motivates me to make these videos and to keep analyzing and keep growing myself. So the next endgame video on part 2 of the practicum should be coming up pretty soon. Thanks again so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.